In this final installment of our Let's Read project, I will address what I take to be the key themes of Notes from Underground. Of course, as one of Dostoevsky's most celebrated works, this novella has attracted an enormous wealth of scholarly attention already, and I can't claim to make a dent on what is already out there. But for what they're worth, here are my own thoughts on our story. The first thing to address is the voice of the story's narrator. As noted in my introductory comments, Notes from Underground was originally conceived as a polemic in response to the radicalism of Nikolai Chernyshevsky. But judged as a polemic of his day, it is a colossal failure, and it could never hope to gain any sort of traction in moving the social needle. The stylistic contrast between Chernyshevsky's What Is to Be Done and Dostoevsky's novella could not be any more stark. Chernyshevsky presents us with larger-than-life characters, heroes animated by a clear, internally consistent ideology from which they do not waver, whose decisive exploits move the society around them. It serves as a rousing call to action, and arguably it was a significant force in moving the October Revolution of a half-century later. And then we have this very strange document, haunted by a protagonist wallowing in both self-contradictions and self-pity, who is buffeted about by virtually everyone he meets, who can't make it through a simple dinner party without making an ass of himself, and who behaves repugnantly towards the one person he has the opportunity to bully. It is hard to imagine a tract less likely to garner public sympathy or widespread support. Indeed, it did not. Upon its publication in 1864, it received almost no attention from its immediate audience, and was rumored to be little more than a cynical, subversive novella of small value. But the contrast with Chernyshevsky is striking in another respect as well. Dostoevsky has presented us with a real human being. Episodes that Chernyshevsky swiftly skates through in his novel to show off the heroism of his stock characters are here developed by Dostoevsky with a careful artistry that would forever be beyond the reach of his rival. And in each case, Chernyshevsky's original intent is spectacularly subverted. The altercation with the officer is no longer a brief anecdote about proper pride in the face of unjust social prejudices, but is now a detailed account of the outrageous vanity of a bruised ego, bristling with self-absorbed indignation. The story of the fallen prostitute is no longer a feel-good narrative of the redemption of a lost soul by her virtuous benefactor, but something much darker, and made darker in part because of the underground man's consciousness of just such feel-good narratives and his frustrated desire to control them. This happens because Dostoevsky is not dealing with tropes in the service of some overarching ideological goal, but with the real human psyche. A successful political tract could never be bogged down with these subtleties. But Dostoevsky couldn't help himself, and rather than giving us a clear-eyed philosophical system using literature as his vehicle, he gave us a work of art instead. So we must be careful not to identify Dostoevsky with the underground man. There are autobiographical elements here. Dostoevsky, like his narrator, was a product of the 1840s, heavily influenced by the Romanticism of the era. Like his narrator, he suffered from acute vanity in his young adulthood. And there's no question that some of the arguments presented by the underground man in Part 1 would be Dostoevsky's own. But many of them he would strenuously oppose. Most notably, the final thoughts his narrator presents about Lisa replicate the perverse moral reasoning of one of his most notorious villains, Prince Valkovsky from Insulted and Injured. In this vein, readers should be warned against being too thoroughly seduced by this narrative voice. The acerbic rhetoric on display can have a hypnotic effect, especially to those who might have been wounded by society themselves. When we are this deeply inside the man's head, we might lose sight of the fact that the head we are in is not an appealing one. But in the final analysis, the first sentences of these notes are quite accurate. We are dealing with a sick and spiteful man, not a hero to emulate. So, who is the underground man? The answer, I think, is given to us by the author's note right at the beginning of Part 1. Such persons, he writes, quote, not only may, but positively must exist in our society when we consider the circumstances in the midst of which our society is formed. Unquote. The underground man is a product of the ideas of his time. He is one possible perverse result when the Romanticism of the 1840s and the deterministic utilitarianism of the 1860s reach their ultimate destinations. In what follows, I wish to track each of these elements in turn. At the novella's opening, he is most obviously wrestling with the problem of determinism. In Chernyshevsky's system, determinism takes the form of a psychological egoism, where human beings always act in ways that they believe to be in their self-interest. Further, if people simply had an accurate understanding of what their self-interest truly consisted in, they would rationally choose to behave in good and productive ways. This rational, egoistic variant of determinism the underground man finds simply risible, easily refuted by a cursory glance at actual human behavior. The prophet of rational egoism himself will go out and behave in self-destructive ways, and 19th century history reveals enlightened civilization becoming more bloodthirsty, not less. But determinism in general is not so easily shaken off, and the narrator apparently has both deeply internalized the idea and come to hate it. As a hyperconscious being, he cannot actually believe in the justice of his own causes, neither to forgive nor to avenge perceived wrongs that he has suffered at the hands of others. After all, as the old cliché goes, to understand is to excuse, and once the behavior of his enemies is contextualized against the laws of nature, the justice of his case simply evaporates, and there is nothing to forgive and nothing to avenge. All he is left with is simply spite. Righteous indignation is impossible for him, let alone acting in response to it. He is saddled with all the feelings as of people being morally responsible for their behavior, but can't actually believe in it, and becomes paralyzed as a result. In fact, for those interested in a brief articulation of the problem of determinism as it touches upon free will, Part 1, Chapter 5 is a handy place to look. The passage here could have been ripped straight from the pages of Baron d'Holbach, and Nietzsche would later argue in a similar vein. And so, in a few brief chapters, Dostoevsky has exposed what he takes to be a deep incongruity in the radicalism of a Chernyshevsky and others of his ilk. The man of action, whom the underground man derides, is not paralyzed by this problem, and acts in the naive belief in the justice of his cause, despite endorsing a deterministic picture of the world and of human nature. The man of action must then be a stupid man, blessedly bereft of the disease of hyper-consciousness. Now, the underground man's reaction to the threat of determinism has been far from universal in the history of philosophical thought. and he recognizes this. Why not say simply that free will consists not in one's behavior breaking a deterministic causal chain, but in one's behavior being determined in the right kind of way, where one's actions are necessarily caused by a clear understanding of one's own interests? But to this common doctrine, independently affirmed by Augustine, Aquinas, Hobbes, Locke, Leibniz, Hume, Mill, and the lion's share of academics and philosophy departments at modern universities, the underground man responds at the end of Part 1, Chapter 8, with 6 short words dripping with scorn. As if free will meant that. But what do you do if you crave what you can never believe in? The results appear unhealthy and distorted. On the one hand, the underground man stridently insists that he is a man and not a piano key, and reserves to himself the right to claim his most advantageous advantage, that is, his own free choices. But since our paradoxicalist cannot really believe in this, what he really ends up doing is impotently raging against the laws of nature and arithmetic, or metaphorically bashing his head against a stone wall in a refusal to be reconciled to it. But this reaction to determinism per se is connected to his revolt against the whole value structure to which it is associated. Those who, like Chernyshevsky, embrace determinism happily often do so because they believe they can harness those deterministic causal forces in the service of some overarching social goals. B.F. Skinner is another name that comes to mind in this regard. But the underground man treats those goals themselves with disdain. The image that takes center stage here is, of course, the Crystal Palace, the grand symbol of man's scientific and industrial achievements, and the beatific future toward which they promise to lead. In general, Chernyshevsky and others would express hopes for advances in reason and the organization of civilization to spread material advantage to the widest possible array of people. But the underground man cannot get on board with this vision. Part of this is that he recoils from the assumption of determinism that it carries, but he also wonders whether we can really identify our interests with any certainty, and he further insists that this emphasis on rationality neglects the greater share of man's nature, which has nothing to do with reason whatsoever. We like to exercise our capacities in all kinds of ways, both rational and irrational, and can take pleasure out of smashing things or even in a toothache, and his phenomenology of that pleasure is both fascinating and twisted. And his objections are even more general in 2 different ways. On the one hand, even if we could all agree that the Crystal Palace is a great goal toward which we should all be striving, we would be mortified at the thought of actually achieving our object. For at that point, what do we strive for? Our lives would swiftly be stripped of meaning. Indeed, without suffering, he insists, we would practically cease to be conscious and lose our humanity. But if any ultimate goal would be a great misfortune to achieve, why strive toward anything? Even further, how can we define our goals at all? Once we take the transcendent view of the hyper-conscious, all labels affixed to people and their ambitions seem perfectly arbitrary. The underground man apparently wishes to be properly defined in some way, even as a sluggard, but worries that all such definitions will slide right off of him. He can't bring himself to pursue any project, because all such projects seem to lack any ultimate grounding. Here we have Dostoevsky anticipating a theme that would be developed by 20th century existentialist philosophers, and perhaps also in a famous 1971 paper by Thomas Nagel, entitled The Absurd. This deep and perplexing problem persists all the way to the final page of the novella, where the underground man denies that we even know what it means to live. Quote, "Leave us alone without books, and we shall be lost and in confusion at once. We shall not know what to join on to, what to cling to, what to love and what to hate, what to respect and what to despise." Unquote. That is perhaps the man's deepest conceptual problem, and it is exacerbated by his Romanticism. How do we conceptualize the world? Books help us to do so. Some of them even point us to the beautiful and the sublime. But books also put us at one remove from real life. A well-read man can switch the conceptual apparatus of one book for the framework of another, cheaply at will. And the delights they provide can actually substitute for the disappointments of the real world. Fantasies, after all, are under our control in a way that reality is not. In fact, it may be worthwhile at some point to read notes back to back with an earlier story entitled White Nights. The parallels there are notable. In each case, we are dealing with a narrator with an astonishing proclivity for romantic dreaming, and in each case the narrator has an adventure in the real world with a young woman. But the contrast in tone is also notable. White Nights is a bright and warm narrative, brimming with optimism, whereas Notes from Underground is a miserable affair. Somewhere along the way, Dostoevsky appears to have discovered how egoistic the romantic impulse can be. Ever since Goethe penned The Sorrows of Young Werther, this movement offered the excessively vain a method of affirming their own spiritual superiority over the masses. Dostoevsky introduces this concern in The Village of Stepanchikovo and continues it in The Insulted and Injured. Here he cranks up the volume. It is not as though Dostoevsky has turned his back on the beautiful and the sublime. We can sympathize with his narrator's revulsion at the boorishness of his old schoolfellows who mindlessly trample on his values. And the verbal tapestry he weaves at the brothel about domestic happiness, in Part 2, Chapter 6, articulates a vision that any good-hearted person should embrace. But when push comes to shove, the underground man doesn't really care about these values. He cares about the feelings they can produce and the social mileage he can get out of manipulating them. So, in Part 2, Chapter 2, he confesses that in his young adulthood he would brim over with a love for all mankind, ecstatic feelings stoked by his own dreaming, and then satisfy his longing to embrace humanity by spending an awkward afternoon at the residence of his boss. The man prefers humanitarian sentiments without humanitarian behavior. Or alternatively, he would spice up his love for the beautiful and the sublime with occasional bouts of carnal vice, probably visits to prostitutes, and his self-loathing combined with his high ideals would create a sort of sweet and sour cocktail which he learned to enjoy. Obviously, his posturing over ideals is how he attempts to gain power over his schoolfellows, and later over Lisa, being successful only temporarily in the latter case. And he swaps out his preferred narratives with dizzying swiftness, trying out whatever angle would turn him into the hero, if not a noble one, at least a dominant one. We see this, for instance, while he is en route to the brothel contemplating his vengeance, oscillating between fantasies of slapping Tverkov and forgiving him in some melodramatic duel. We see him doing this again days later in Part 2, Chapter 8, as he is unable to settle on an angle concerning Lisa. Does he want to slap her around, or does he want to treat her as his redeemed noble wife, while donning the mantle of the hero as per Nekrasov's poem? And of course we see him at it again, at the critical moment, when he slips the 5-ruble note into Lisa's hand as she is heading out the door. If he could not play the role of a noble hero, he could at least be the dominant villain. It was his brain, he insists, that led him to do it, not his heart. His brain, fed on books, prompted him toward a different narrative where he could take a leading role. He is forever caught up in the cycle of artificial attempts at framing the world and negotiating his place in it. On top of all this, there appears to be a confounding issue in the meta-narrative. The novella really has 3 separate voices. Of course, the dominant voice is our 1860s underground man who serves as our narrator. But then there is the voice of his imagined interlocutors, to whom he refers as gentlemen, and with whom he is carrying on an argument, primarily in Part 1. And finally there is his own prior 1840s self, to whose thoughts we gain access in Part 2. Of course, all 3 of these voices are supposed to be coming from the same mind, the author of the notes. And occasionally the line between these voices blurs. For instance, in Part 2, Chapter 8, there is sometimes indeterminacy about whether the ideas are supposed to be the thoughts of the 24-year-old underground man or the thoughts of the 40-year-old narrator, an indeterminacy that is felt in particular for someone voicing the novella. It's worth noting in parenthesis that it was not long after writing notes that Dostoevsky edited and republished his 1846 novella The Double, which explores questions about identity, multiple loci of thoughts in the same mind, and the blurred lines between them. Arguably, something similar, if less dramatic, is happening here. At any rate, our underground man is doing more than cycling through narrative angles as he lives his life. He is also cycling through multiple voices, and it's not always perfectly clear which one is his own. So, can there be any escape from this trap of the artificiality and arbitrariness of human strivings? The answer of the novella is surely yes, and I think Dostoevsky tries to provide it twice. Once in the horribly disfigured Part 1, Chapter 10, and then again more clearly in the penultimate chapter. It is Lisa who gives the most striking presentation of Dostoevsky's solution. She is the one who suffers most in the whole story, and the horrifying imagery the underground man provides her of the prostitute's fate, in Part 2, Chapter 7, during their first encounter, might well be exactly what is in store for her. And yet, despite her own desperate situation, when she visits his flat, she sees him, his humble circumstances, his humiliation at the hand of his own servant, his moral weakness, his hysteria, his pettiness, his excruciating vanity, everything, and she chooses to love him. This is the critical moment of the man's life. His redemption is sitting right there, freely offered. He just has to accept it. But to accept it, he must allow himself to be weak. He must lose his spot in the narrative, and he simply cannot tolerate the role reversal. So he seizes his place in a new narrative, takes his vengeance, and loses his chance. 16 years later, he sits in his own hell, and it is a hell he has created for himself. The underground man, enchanted by his own stories, is incapable of loving another real human being, however much he can love humanity in the abstract. He tells us that as early as his school days, he wound up bullying the one friend who ever became loyal to him. Even in his maturity, as he narrates the tale, he claims that he, not Lisa, was the chief sufferer in their encounter, and suggests that Lisa might even be better off for it, due to her newfound exalted, righteous indignation that could purify her soul. He remains completely insensitive to the sufferings of another. But if he could love, perhaps he could actually live. And that, I suspect, is what is at the core of the enigmatic Part 1, Chapter 10. We know that Dostoevsky was furious about its mangling at the hands of the censor, and he never had the opportunity to restore it to its original form in print. He claimed that it originally was designed to carry the essential idea of the whole work, which involved the need for Christian faith. But since the only source material we have is the damaged text which went to print, we can only take guesses as to what Dostoevsky was trying to convey. The confusion in this passage centers on the idea of the Crystal Palace. The Crystal Palace, he tells us, is no better than a hen house, a mechanism for keeping dry. So far, so good. Here he is criticizing the Crystal Palace as being nothing more than a device for achieving material interests, and thus not worth our veneration. This is perfectly in keeping with what the underground man has said already. But in the next breath, he speaks of the Crystal Palace differently, as being inconsistent with the laws of nature, an object that he has invented out of his own desires. This cannot be the same Crystal Palace. Somewhere in between these two breaths, the Crystal Palace of Chernyshevsky and the edifice that Dostoevsky himself visited in London has been swapped out for something different, wonderful and ideal, but beyond what the laws of nature can provide. And then there is this very curious passage. Quote, "Perhaps the thing I resented was that of all your edifices there has not been one at which one could not put out one's tongue. On the contrary, I would let my tongue be cut off out of gratitude if things could be so arranged that I should lose all desire to put it out. It is not my fault that things cannot be so arranged, and that one must be satisfied with model flats. Then why am I made with such desires? Can I have been constructed simply in order to come to the conclusion that all my construction is a cheat? Can this be my whole purpose? I do not believe it." Unquote. So Chernyshevsky's Crystal Palace is no better than model flats or a henhouse, and all earthly contrivance can be ridiculed. What he craves is some other Crystal Palace, and he thinks that he is constructed to desire it. What other Crystal Palace? The closest thing we come to glimpsing it in the novella is the love that Lisa offers the underground man. Love despite revealed failings against all the standards of earthly contrivance. That is the thing that ultimately matters. A sort of Christ-like love which stands above all the successes and failures, all the sound and fury of human artifice. Perhaps that is the very thing for which he has been constructed. But the underground man can't help himself, and sticks his tongue out at it, and shatters his own palace. 16 years later, in his mouse hole, he casts about and finds only promises of the material palace of Chernyshevsky, and wonders if his construction is a cheat. It isn't, but he is incapable of seeing how. Such, at any rate, is my analysis of what I take to be the critical and most challenging passage of the text. And indeed, this completes my analysis of the novella generally. It's a testament to the artistry of Notes from Underground that there is much more here that we have not been able to address. But these comments do need to come to an end, and the time has come for me to make my exit. Per usual, if you find these comments to be inaccurate or incomplete, I invite you to improve upon them in the comments section below. I thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the experience.